Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We welcome those, of course, who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. Would ask everyone here in-house to be so courteous as to check that cell phones have been turned off. We will, of course, post our program on the Heritage homepage following today's presentations for your future reference. And our internet viewers are always welcome to send their questions or comments at any time, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our program today is Jack Spencer. Mr. Spencer is Vice President for our Institute for Economic Freedom and Opportunity. He oversees our research on a wide range of domestic policy issues and also oversees our Center for Trade and Economics, whose major annual publication we are launching again today. He previously served as director of our Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Studies, and prior to this, he was our senior research fellow in nuclear energy policy. Please join me in welcoming Jack Spencer. Jack.
Thank you, John. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you. I was waiting for that. I needed a drink of water. Thank you for being here today. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2015 launch of the Index of Economic Freedom. One of 3 indices produced annually by the Heritage Foundation. This one, the one produced by our Institute Institute for Economic Freedom and Opportunity, in collaboration with the Wall Street Journal, will be followed in weeks ahead by indices on military strength and on culture and opportunity. This is an exciting day for us here at Heritage and for me personally. Though this is the 21st edition of the index published by Heritage, it's the first year that I've had the honor to be associated with this very important volume. And we're not the only ones that are excited. Literally, people from around the world look forward to the findings each and every year. And they wait with anticipation for a reason. What the index measures under the umbrella of economic freedom are 10 variables that provide a real-life assessment of the economic health and vitality of every nation it measures. So folks are proud when they are listed near the top, and they should be. Similarly, they're concerned when they drop, and they should be. The value of the Index of Economic Freedom is not just the snapshot in time that it provides each year, however. These snapshots over decades give index readers the ability to see trends over time, and these trends shed light on the actual impacts of government's economic policies. Since its first publication in 1995, the Index of Economic Freedom has chronicled hundreds of examples of government policy changes that have enhanced economic freedom and thereby promoted human progress and greater prosperity. Though numbers and trends are important, context matters as well. This year we've added some new pieces to the index, including 3 new analytical chapters. One chapter compares the outcomes of a series of neighboring countries that have pursued very different economic policies. The other 2 look at the overlap between cronyism and energy and economic freedom. This analytical texture provides important context to the scores. Our panel later on today will look at more detail at these new chapters. The impact of the index, however, does not lie in the pages of the book. Instead, it resides in each of us. For the Index of Economic Freedom provides us each with an opportunity and responsibility to draw lessons from the numbers, the trends, and the analysis. Perhaps the most critical lesson for these tumultuous times is that the power of the free market and the value of economic liberty must be defended. The data we present in our annual Index of Economic Freedom are a good foundation for that discussion. So what did we find? Who's moving up? Who's moving down? Where's the United States? I'm not going to tell you any of that. Instead, we have an exciting morning full of speakers and panelists that will answer these questions and many more. We're especially looking forward to comments from Chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, Paul Ryan, But first, I have the honor this morning of introducing perhaps the index's greatest supporter here at Heritage, Senator Jim DeMint, the president of the Heritage Foundation. Senator.
I should have known there'd be a lot of copies of this around. Jack, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. It's an exciting time of year for us. But as Jack mentioned, we also have a couple of other indexes coming out related to our military defense readiness, as well as the trends in our culture. But today we're talking about the economy, and it's my great pleasure to be a part of this, Jack, along with you and your team. This has been done for 21 years. Heritage and the Wall Street Journal have worked together. I particularly want to thank Paul Gigot for his very insightful forward to our index this year. It's very influential to policymakers around the world. One of the interesting things about traveling around the world as part of Heritage is to see all the countries that are interested in their rating, the criteria, and how they can improve it. And they actually lobby us to convince us that they're not as corrupt as they were, or they're getting better in one measure. But it's very important. And it's important to our country as well. I know from working in the total quality movement for years that you can't improve what you don't measure. And this is measuring by essential economic criteria how free different economies are around the world. And you can't improve unless you continuously measure so that you develop trends over a period of time to see how you're doing. And we measure 178 different countries. Countries that are free economically, such as Singapore, that's number 2 on the rating this year, or Switzerland, that's number 5, or even more oppressive dictatorships such as Zimbabwe or Cuba or North Korea. The United States, unfortunately, was the only country, I think, in the history of the index that actually declined, became less and less free over 7 consecutive years. In 2015, we stabilized at the number 12 spot, trailing countries like New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. The reasons for America's stagnation are as familiar to us as the government's refusal to address any of them. The massive regulatory state, mandates such as Obamacare, grant programs which pick winners and losers in the marketplace, an antiquated, complex tax code that's 7 times longer than War and Peace, puts us at an economic disadvantage to many, many other countries. And all too many corporate interests who you would think would be pushing for free market principles through their political connections continue to lobby for loopholes rather than tax reform and removing regulations that actually might hurt their competitors. The big reason we think that voters sent a new crop of congressmen and senators here last November was to correct a lot of these things, to change the status quo, and to push our country back in the right direction economically. The president will have a choice to make. With folks like Paul Ryan leading on economic revival, the president's going to have a choice of whether or not to continue to obstruct and pontificate, or work with a Congress that is trying to move our country in a direction that would be more economically free. I can't think of a better person to be here today to introduce this index for the year. Paul Ryan and I came into the House at the same time. We were both elected in '98. I was an old guy who came from the business world. Paul actually was a staffer the year before and came back as a congressman. One of the stories I remember most vividly when I first got to Washington is Paul and a few of the other new congressmen walked over to a restaurant near Union Station. We were having dinner, and next to us was a table of staffers having fun, talking about who they were going to be working with this year, and several of them came over to our table and said, Paul, what office are you working in this year? I think he said my own. But there is probably not a better thinker and one with more courage in the House than Paul Ryan. I know I was kind of considered a policy nerd, and Paul was too. We were working on healthcare solutions. He was working on premium support way back in the day. I was working on health savings accounts. We were both working on personal investment accounts for Social Security, various tax reform proposals. And I think the disappointing thing to both of us is, despite a lot of work, it was actually hard to even get Republicans to sign up and advocate for a lot of these things that we had talked about. But he's continued to talk about them and write about them, to innovate, and I can't think of a better person to be chairman of Ways and Means, to develop tax solutions, to fix our entitlement programs, to work on trade issues. And I just told him, I just hope he'll have an opportunity to be chairman of that committee under a conservative president who is pushing in the same direction. But Paul understands all the things that create economic freedom, and he's advocated for them courageously for years, and I could not be more honored to have a great friend and a great advocate for freedom with us today. Paul, come tell us about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. You know, I've been reading this thing since I was in my mid-20s. This is truly an impressive body of work, and as was mentioned, countries around the world pay attention to this. I hope ours does too. I want to, first of all, congratulate Ambassador Terry Miller and Anthony Kim for their hard work on this again. And I also want to mention the fact that our country received an uptick in our rating this year. And one of the reasons why we see this uptick is because since we took over the House in 2011, we started cutting spending. We started capping the kind that Congress is in control of on an annual basis, discretionary spending. And so I think it's noteworthy that because of the new Republican Congress that took over in 2011, we brought some temper to the out-of-control spending that was happening here in Washington, and as a result, it made us more free. That's a good step in the right direction with many, many steps to follow. Now, after reading this report, my big takeaway is this. In the free world, there is always going to be a new frontier. It's exciting. And the new frontier for us is the global economy. And in the global economy, we have incredible opportunities in front of us if we seize these opportunities. Trade is the opportunity that I want to mention. Trade liberalization and trade freedom is something that is clearly articulated here in the index. And we have an opportunity in front of us right now with negotiations of 2 trade agreements with Asia and with Europe. These 2 agreements, if successfully completed, taken together, represent 1 billion new customers for America and America's products, and 2/3 of the global GDP. Now here's the deal with trade. When we get trade agreements, we usually put ourselves in a better trading posture to do well as a country. Take, for example, the fact that if you add up all the countries we have trade agreements with, we have a manufacturing trade surplus with them. You add all the countries up that we don't have trade agreements with, we have a big manufacturing trade deficit with. So it is in our interest as a country to get trade agreements. The other thing is if you're standing still on trade, you are falling behind. Because other countries are going around the world getting bilateral agreements for themselves and freezing America out in the process. So it's very important that we stay on our toes, that we engage, that we lower barriers to free trade, that we lower barriers to free enterprise. Now, as we do this, I think we're going to confront some other issues as well. And one of the issues that needs confronting right here in this Congress, in this country, as Heritage has done such a good job of playing out, is cronyism. We can attack cronyism here at home and abroad also through trade, whether it's state-owned investment, state-owned enterprises, or our own kind of cronyism that we see manifest itself through our own economic policy. I think the creed that the thinkers here at Heritage have articulated, opportunity for all, favoritism for none, that ought to be a creed that directs us and guides us going forward in the conduct of our economic policy. Because one of the dangers we face here and abroad is cronyism. And cronyism in this manifestation means big government and big business kind of grafting onto each other, uniting in a common cause to rig the rules, to write the rules for themselves, to erect barriers to entry against would-be competitors who are going to compete with them. Guess who loses? Consumers lose. Freedom loses. Opportunity loses. Entrepreneurship loses. And so what we need to do, if we want to improve our economic outlook, improve our freedom, are knock down those trade barriers, get more access for our products to be able to sell abroad, and make sure that we do it in a way that honors our principles of freedom, of equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome, of getting the ability for Americans of every way, shape, and form, every size of business to be able to compete. We do not want to prevent would-be competitors from getting in an industry and competing. We want to open it up, because by opening up competition domestically and internationally, we give the ability for everybody to make and improve their lot in life. You know, Abraham Lincoln, 177 years ago today, argued that the ambitious and talented would grow bored if all they had to do was preserve a country that other people had founded. Of course, he was the best counterexample to that. His life work was securing this country. The way I see it, the American idea is what is at stake. The American idea as we know it, as we were taught it, as sons and daughters of immigrants, is that the condition of your birth, it doesn't determine the outcome of your life. Whoever you are, wherever you come from, however you started, the only thing that limits you from reaching your potential is your own effort and God-given talent. We want to make sure that we are still that country. We want to make sure that your success is determined by your merit, by your hard work, not based upon who you know or your political connections. And that kind of economic policy, if we don't write the rules of global economy, will be what dominates. That's the last point I'll make. If we don't get engaged globally, if we don't get engaged in writing these kinds of trade agreements that respect the rule of law, that lower barriers, that protect human rights and human dignity and entrepreneurialism, transparency, accountability, contracts, then other countries that don't rate very high on the index of economic freedom, they will write the rules of the global economy. With TPP, it's really clear. Do you want China writing the rules of the global economy in Asia, or do you want a free enterprise loving nation like America writing the rules of the global economy? So all of these issues come home to roost. And the good news is we've got a very easy guide that tells us what works and what doesn't. We know what gets people out of poverty. We know what produces upward mobility. We know what gives us better environment, what gives us better democracy, what gives us better, higher living standards. So now we just have to go and practice what we read and practice what we preach. And I want to thank the scholars here at Heritage for doing this, for identifying this, and for giving us a measurement, a barometer, and a sense of accountability. And I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Congressman. We will now move on to our first panel of speakers, which will include the authors of the Index of Economic Freedom, Ambassador Terry Miller and Anthony Kim. I'll invite you both up to the stage. I'll just do brief introductions, and then I will hand it over to them. Ambassador Terry Miller is the director of our Center for Data Analysis here at Heritage and the Center for Trade and Economics. And Anthony is our senior policy analyst for economic freedom, both of whom will tell us in far more detail about the index. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. And let me add my welcome to all of you today here at the Heritage Foundation. And by the way, since Jack didn't clearly define it, I'm Terry, he's Anthony, just so you know. We want to talk about the actual results of the Index of Economic Freedom this year. We want to walk you through some of the country-specific results. We want to talk a little bit about the United States as well. But before we start that, we want to talk a little bit about the structure of the index itself. And now, we've been doing this for a long time. We've been doing this since 1995. And what that means is that we have a very large base of data. that we use to inform the conclusions that we arrive at in the index itself. When you think about it, we have about 180 countries that we look at. We've been doing it for 21 years. We've got probably 45 to 50 data points for each country, and you add all that up, it means we've got a database with about 150,000 specific data points in it. We make that data freely available to policymakers, to you, to researchers, both in the United States and around the globe, and we hope that people will make use of this. We put a lot of energy into collecting and collating this data, and we hope everyone can take advantage of it. Now, how has the world been doing in terms of economic freedom? Well, over time, actually, we've been doing quite well. You can see on this graph that since the index first started, we've gained about 3.5 points of economic freedom on average for the world as a whole. On an index like ours that measures things from 0 to 100, that's a pretty significant movement over time. You can see that little dip there. It started in 2008, actually, as countries around the globe made some very bad policy decisions at the beginning of the financial crisis and recession that I think has led to prolonging that crisis and recession for a significant amount of time. But starting a couple of years ago, we saw economic freedom begin to pick up again around the world. And you'll see a little bit later that that uptick is also reflected in the United States. And now, before we go further, I'd like to turn the podium over to Anthony to give you a little bit of a glimpse into how we actually measure economic freedom.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Anthony Kim. So one of the key objectives we had when we started our index back in 1995 is how to present reliable, objective, and timely analysis of different countries. And the key to achieving that goal was to have very simple but very transparent yet structured methodology. And this little table shows that matrix. Think of it as operation matrix or infrastructure matrix. Taking one step back, if you want to develop your economy, your company, say from point A to point B, you need some kind of vehicle. You need some kind of means to achieve that goal. When you build a car, you need 4 tires, steering wheels, and engines, and those key components. And these 4 pillars, rule of law, limited government, regulatory efficiency, open markets, they all contribute to that important vehicle when a country is trying to transform itself to a better, prosperous country. And under those 4 pillars, we have 10 specific components, ranging from property rights, fiscal freedom, where we measure tax rates, tax burden, the size of the government, and the business freedom, labor freedom, those little regulations, in terms of labor market and actual business settings, and further down to market openness. Chairman Ryan talked about the importance of trade freedom. Here we go. This is one key part of overall economic freedom. So as we build a car, we cannot have a car without engine. We cannot have a car without steering wheel. The same logic goes to our index of economic freedom too. We treat these 10 components equally, meaning we don't do any weighted average. We take a simple average of 10 components and we assess countries' economic policy. And we don't do a perception level, that kind of analysis. So in our 2015 Index of Economic Freedom, we do have very well-performing economies. Number 1 this year, once again, it's Hong Kong. Hong Kong has been retaining this top position since 1995. And as you can notice, this year's gap between Hong Kong and Singapore has further narrowed. And I think this is good because when we have this competition in the top spot, that means a lot more other countries want to get into the game and they want to implement good policies as they go forward. And notice New Zealand, Australia, last year, Australia was ahead of New Zealand, but this year they flipped the ranking spot, and the number 5 is Switzerland. And these 1 through 5, as you can see, they're above score of 80. In our index, countries that score above 80, we classify those countries as free economies. So these 5 economies are truly free economies according to our index of economic freedom. And on your right column, you see Canada, Chile, Estonia, Ireland, and Mauritius. Mauritius, just in case, this is a small African nation. So in fact, in these top 10 performing economies, we have every region, 6 regions, from sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, through Europe. Estonia is a welcome comeback. Back in 2008, Estonia ranked one of the top 10 economies, but since then they fell down. But through their good policies, including government spending cuts and other regulatory reforms, they come back to top 10 performers. And the other side, we have a very notable countries here, ranging from North Korea to Argentina. These countries are all classified as repressed economies. Obviously, we do have a lot more repressed economies scoring the score of 50, under the score of 50, but these 10 economies are the bottom 10 repressed economies. Argentina, as we all know, this is a very sad case. The country used to enjoy high level of stability and prosperity, but year by year, because of those big government policies and regulatory overreach and cronyism and erosion of the rule of law, the country is joining the club of Venezuela, Cuba, and North Korea. Now, you probably recognize we are missing one big country within top 10. That is the United States of America. And let's see what happens there through Ambassador Miller.
Thank you, Anthony. Leave that previous slide up there just for a second, because I just want to mention, call your attention to what human tragedy is represented by some of the countries on this list. In addition to Argentina, you've got countries like Iran, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela that at one time were extremely prosperous and mostly free countries with both political and economic freedom. And as the citizens in those countries have lost their freedom, these countries have dropped down in our rankings, but even more important, they've dropped down in the quality of life that their citizens enjoy. And so it really is the conditions of life for the people that we're ultimately measuring when we measure this index. And when you look at these bottom 10 countries, you see some incredible human tragedies represented. Now, it's not just the top 10 and the bottom 10. I do want to emphasize that in every region of the world, we have countries that are top performers, and you can see them listed here. Canada leading in North America, Switzerland in Europe, Bahrain, the top performer in the Middle East and North Africa, Chile in Latin America, Hong Kong, of course, in the Asia Pacific region, and then Mauritius, which counts as a sub-Saharan African country, though it is, as Anthony said, an island off the coast of Africa. But again, there's a little different group of countries that we want to recognize because of the very positive achievement they have made this year in the index. We had 37 countries in the index this year out of the 178 that we graded that achieved their highest scores ever in terms of economic freedom. These are the 10 highest ranking of those 37 countries. And I think if you look at this list, you can see countries that have really made amazing efforts to reform their economies, to integrate themselves into the world financial and trading systems, and they're enjoying much higher levels of prosperity as a result. We promised we'd talk about the United States a little bit, and this is a mixed story. You can see from this graph that the U.S. had a fairly significant decline. And actually, the decline in the U.S. until this year was actually far more significant than is shown here. This graph only goes back to 2011. The decline in the U.S. score started in 2008. 7 consecutive years of decline. We all know the reasons, I think. I can tell you exactly what caused the decline in score as we measure economic freedom. It was things like the TARP program, which hurt our financial freedom. It was the bailout of the automotive companies, which hurt the rule of law. It was stimulus spending, which caused an explosive growth in both our deficit and the size of government spending in the United States. On the regulatory side, it was Obamacare and the Dodd-Frank financial regulatory bill that decreased the regulatory efficiency of our system in the United States. Those really are the factors that caused the U.S. score to decline in such a sustained manner, in such a dramatic manner. Now that's turned around this year. The main thing that has caused the turnaround is the slowdown in the growth of government spending. We actually haven't managed to reduce government spending yet, but it has reduced a bit as a percentage of our gross domestic product, and so that shows up leading a slight uptick in our index score for this year. So we're very happy to see that. And I was happy to hear Chairman Ryan talk about the influence that the Congress has had in making that possible, this uptick in economic freedom. We put the graph up there. We're number 12. Well, it's not something to be particularly proud of. I would say, though, that the United States, compared to other countries in the world, still enjoys a relatively high degree of economic freedom, but of course not as high as we once did have and enjoy. The United States, for example, in 2007 was ranked number 4 in the Index of Economic Freedom. Now we're at number 12, seemingly stuck there. We can just hope that that upward tick continues in the future. Now, what does this mean, though, in real terms? Well, the most important thing about being number 12 and dropping to number 12 is that it means we're falling behind some of our competitors around the world. Now, what we put on this graph is the comparison of the U.S. economic freedom score with the average scores of 3 countries that are fairly similar in terms of their organization to us: New Zealand, Australia, and Switzerland. Those are all free economies, and you can see how the U.S. score has deteriorated. 7 years ago, we were actually higher. Our score was higher than the average score for these countries. Now we've fallen far behind, about 5 points behind these economies. So that means that we're not as competitive. We don't do as good a job in promoting entrepreneurship. We're not as open to the rest of the world. And we may be falling behind a little bit even in the rule of law and the control of corruption in our society. So these are factors that cause us great concern and where we need to see sustained policy improvements in the future. Now I'm going to turn this back to Anthony to talk a little bit about some of the benefits of economic freedom as we see them on a worldwide basis.
As in any research, especially empirical research, when we have the numbers, we have a great temptation to compare that with some other independent variable so that we can show why we measure economic freedom, in fact, over the past 21 years, and why economic freedom matters and why countries and policymakers should pay attention to those good policies that will promote economic freedom. One simple measure is that the correlation, the relationship, statistical relationship between the level of economic freedom and GDP per capita. We do recognize the shortcomings of the GDP per capita, but at the same time, this is most widely available and universally proven in a way of simplistic measurement in terms of gauging the relationship between one economic variable versus another. As you can see here, in every region, the countries with a greater economic freedom, they enjoy higher level of prosperity. In every continent, we have a little bit of difference between free and repressed, but overall, the relationship is quite clear. Once again, countries with a greater economic freedom, they enjoy higher level of prosperity. And if you turn that around to a different dimension, the previous chart shows you the relationship between level to level. But this chart shows you the change. The other aspect that's very critical to us, to our research, is the change of economic freedom scores. So we did that exercise utilizing our index data over the past 21 years, And here we divided 3 different time periods, 20 years, 10 years, 5 years, to represent short-term, medium-term, and long-term. In every period, as you can see, there's a clear relationship, once again, between the greater rate of advancing economic freedom that leads to greater rate of economic growth. So that indicates that both in level-to-level measure and the change-to-change level measure, change-to-change measure, economic freedom matters to prosperity and greater economic dynamism. Now, it is very true, even within the repressed economies like Argentina or even Cuba, there can be some little movement in terms of economic freedom scores. But we have to keep in mind that score change is very minimal. This chart, what we call the banana chart, it shows that dynamic relationship. As you can see, until the country gets to around 55 or 60, they tend to be just, collated together. So, but after they hit the score of 60 point, which we identify moderately free, they can take off. So this indicates that, once again, the positive relationship between economic freedom and prosperity, but more importantly, the commitment that country will require to have in terms of advancing those good policies that will promote economic freedom. But once again, as we know, economic freedom is not always about material well-being, and it's not just about money. So we're going to talk about sort of social aspect and overall well-being that economic freedom brings in.
You know, the left likes to talk about goals like healthcare, protection of the environment, education policy. Well, interestingly enough, we've looked at independent measures of those from organizations like the Yale Center of Law, Policy and the Environment, or the UN Development Program's Index of Human Development. And what we find is that instead of command and control kinds of government programs, if you want to achieve progress on these kinds of social goals that in fact we all favor, the way to achieve that is through improving your levels of economic freedom. There's a very strong correlation between high levels of economic freedom and positive outcomes on things like the environment, education, health policy, overall human development, again, as measured by the United Nations Development Program. So we also have some positive relationships between economic freedom and political freedom. We don't measure political freedom directly in this index, but we do try to compare our results to what's happening in the political world around the world. And what we find is that countries with higher levels of economic freedom actually have a much greater tendency towards durable and sustainable democracy. And then also looking at overall social progress, that's from the an index, actually a competitor of ours called the Legatum Index Institute, which produces an index of prosperity. We've taken their social progress index and compared it to our economic freedom indicators, and we find that countries with higher levels of economic freedom have much higher levels of social progress. And the last thing I want to mention, and perhaps the most significant of all, is the correlation between higher levels of economic freedom and the reduction in poverty. This is actually a great success story for the global economy. Over the past 20 years, the poverty rate worldwide has basically been cut in half, from about 40% of the people in the world to about 20% of the people in the world living in poverty. And you can see from the other graphs on this chart how economic freedom has gone up, global GDP has gone up, and poverty has come down. So what this is all about is improving the livelihoods and the level of prosperity for people around the world. And there are pretty significant relationships that are apparent from the data.
So if I may, we talked about a lot of numbers and statistical relationship that we find through our index of economic freedom. But as we all know, I mean, economic freedom is not just about numbers and rankings and those, GDP per capita data. What really matters is ideas and values. And if I may, we have Dr. Edwin Fulner, our founder of the Heritage Foundation. As many of you know, in many leading organizations, we have a vision statement. Our vision is building an America where freedom, opportunity, prosperity, civil society flourish. You will probably see that sign when you try to exit the building in the elevator, so you'll get reminded. But the point is very clear why we do our Index of Economic Freedom every year. We want to promote those values and ideas, freedom, opportunity, prosperity, and civil society. They are not disconnected. They are not mutually exclusive. They are all interrelated. And I'm positive that people around the world, they want to enjoy, they want to share, they want to spread those values and ideas. And that's why we do have a lot of people's strong desire for greater economic freedom. And that gives us greater motivation and incentive to provide objective and reliable data every year as much as we can. So thanks again for joining us. And I do know that you probably have a lot of burning questions in your mind, and we'll be happy to take those. Thank you very much.
If you have a question, please raise your hand, and we'll bring a microphone around. And if you'll wait for the microphone, and please just identify yourself and your institution. Well, let's start right down here in front.
John Zhang with CTI TV of Taiwan. Taiwan is ranked number 14 this year. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? How Taiwan is doing economically. Taiwan aspires to join the TPP. Would the ranking this year help Taiwan's bid in that regard? Thank you very much.
I think absolutely. Taiwan's a great success story, obvious success story economically, and they've had a sustained rise in economic freedom, 5 years running in our Index of Economic Freedom, and that's translating into higher growth rates and better social outcomes for the people of Taiwan. We're quite pleased at the record that Taiwan shows. In fact, we're so pleased that we're going to launch the index overseas for the first time ever in Taipei. Will be our first stop of our international tour, and in deciding to do that, we wanted to recognize the great progress that Taiwan has achieved. Now, as far as Taiwanese participation in the TPP, I think we would be in favor of the widest possible participation of countries in the TPP. Now, you have to caveat that a little bit, because the more countries you involve in a negotiation like this, the harder it becomes to actually bring it to a conclusion. Chairman Ryan talked about the urgency of bringing TPP in particular to a conclusion, to a positive result. Now, there's no question, I think, that adding Taiwan into the mix would add a lot of support for a more liberal and a better, higher standard trade agreement. So we would certainly be in favor of that, with the caveat that we don't really want to delay these negotiations out over time. We'd like to bring this to a conclusion. That said, countries will be able to join into TPP after the agreement is actually adopted. So that's an opportunity for a number of countries to participate as well. Back here.
Thank you. Alexander Panov, Russian Service, Voice of America. How could you comment a stable position of Russia somewhere between Liberia and Guinea? And it looks like annexation of Crimea, war in Ukraine, and American sanction didn't reflect in Russian position. Please, your comments.
I think your question itself contains the answer in a way, because the fact that the Russian economy, the big economy with a lot of natural resource and human talent, they're not competing with other advanced economies. I think that's a human tragedy. And we all do know why that's happening. I mean, Russia has been trying to make some cosmetic reforms here and there through tax rates changes and other regulatory reforms. But as we all know, the problem is bigger. the role of the government and also rule of law. And we do know that what kind of private business is operating there. Those crony capitalism we've been all aware of, I think that's the problem of the Russian economy. So I think that Russian leadership, if I may say this, probably know the answer, but they don't exercise that answer probably. That's why Russia is ranked below 100. Maybe in the middle.
Yeah, in the middle.
Thank you so much, Alberto Pimienta with Spanish service of Voice of America. I just wanted to see if you could speak a little bit more about the cases of Venezuela and Argentina. And obviously, you know, by analyzing all this data, you can actually kind of see what's coming this year. If you could talk a little bit about that. And then also about the good cases of what you mentioned of Colombia and then Chile, who's number 7, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, well, Argentina and Venezuela are countries that were middle-income countries, and they're kind of holding on by their fingernails to that status. Economic conditions for the average person in each of those countries have worsened very significantly, I would say, in the case of Venezuela in recent years. We have cases in both these countries of really terrible political leadership. Leadership does matter. The policies that countries put in place can make a huge difference in the lives of citizens. And when you have sustained poor leadership, leadership that is more interested in preserving its own prerogatives, taking care of its friends and cronies economically, siphoning wealth out of the society for its own personal gain or its own political ends of one kind or another, often to sustain itself in power in some way. You see these societies don't do a very good job of providing opportunity for all. It's a classic case of favoritism. We talk about opportunity for all, favoritism for none. And I think you see in these societies places where the whole mechanism of government has been directed at maintaining the status and wealth of a small elite group within society. And as a result, the people in general are suffering greatly. There are some wonderful success stories in Latin America. Chile is one. Chile's had a great record historically in our index, and they're still in the top 10. But I would single out Colombia even more for their recent rise in economic freedom. We've seen in Colombia a move from a country that was, of course, mired in conflict and had an economic system that was so lacking in rule of law that it was almost impossible for the legitimate part of the economy to flourish well. Well, that's all turned around. In the past 10 to 15 years, we've seen just remarkable progress in stabilizing the country, in integrating Colombia more into the international trading system. As a result, they've just shot up in our index and are showing great economic results at the same time.
And we'll go this side first, and then we'll come back. So.
Good morning. My name is Rocha. I am the ambassador of Cabo Verde. My country has a very modest position, just the 3rd ranking in Africa, after Mauritius and Botswana, and the 60th position in the world. I thank Heritage Foundation to support with the stimulus the freedom, the economic freedom in countries like Cabo Verde. We are doing our best, combining good governance, democratic rule of law, and economic reforms. But there are huge challenges in implementing policies in the context of small island states. This is one point that I would like you to comment. The second one, I've been hearing here today people talking about TPP, about US European trade agreement, but nobody spoke about AGOA. And AGOA is under the process of reauthorization. How this index, pushing for economic freedom, can be in support of AGOA reauthorization? I'd like to hear you on that. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Cabo Verde is, of course, also a great success story. And Ambassador, it was very nice to see you here. Cabo Verde was on that list of countries that were among the top improvers in the index. And again, they have had a sustained record in recent years of annual improvements in economic freedom. So this is a country that clearly is on the right path moving forward. And one of the conclusions of the index that I think is most important, it's something Anthony mentioned earlier, but I want to reemphasize it, is that it doesn't matter where you are on the economic freedom scale. If you make a change in policy that improves your economic freedom, it's highly likely that wherever you are on that scale, you will enjoy an increase, a spurt in economic growth. And that, of course, is what builds wealth in a society. We see changes in economic freedom correlated very highly with innovation in societies and also with the ability of societies to support entrepreneurial activity. So all of these things happen. It doesn't matter if you're in the 60s. If your policies are moving in the right direction, you're going to see very significant economic and social progress. The ambassador asked specifically about AGOA. We here at the Heritage Foundation are very strong supporters of AGOA. That's a trade preference cooperative arrangement between the United States and many African countries. We also are a strong supporter of the General System of Preferences, which is yet another trade preference program that provides opportunities for African countries that are willing to take those steps to open their economies to the global economy to trade with the United States and enjoy the opportunities that we have in our own marketplace. I think it's been a very important spur to economic growth in those African countries that have taken advantage of it. Unfortunately, not all the countries of Africa do take advantage of it. But I think in the case of Cabo Verde, we have a country that indeed has taken advantage and will likely continue to do so in the future.
Just quickly on AGOA, I think it's now over 10-year-old, so we do believe that this is time to upgrade AGOA program. And gentleman on the front, you had a question?
I'm also from Voice of America, China branch. Could you talk a little bit about China, whether China is doing, I'm surprised nobody mentioned China yet. Yeah. So is it doing better or worse than previous year? Also, Senator Demin mentioned some country would lobby your organization for a better ranking. So what do they specifically do in their lobbying efforts? And also cronyism in America, why is this a problem in the United States? I would think this is a term you describe a repressed economy or a dictatorship. Okay, thank you so much.
Oh, well, I actually was surprised it took so long for a question about China. Usually that's one of the first countries we're asked about. China's a very interesting case study, and it's kind of sui generis because of its size and its significance. But in any case, there's a good economic freedom story to tell about China, even though the record of economic freedom there is not particularly strong. What we've seen in China over the last 3 decades, really, are very high growth rates, very high economic growth rates, and that's something I think everybody in the world welcomes, or certainly should welcome if they don't. Because a prosperous China is a China that's going to be a better neighbor to all the rest of us in the world, and their economic progress will help support economic progress in the United States and elsewhere. So we're all looking to achieve that. But that high growth rates that we've seen historically in China really started now 30 years ago at the time when Deng Xiaoping was chairman in China, the leader of China, and he instituted some reforms when he came in. And as a result of that, China was able to integrate into the world trading and a little bit into the financial system, but mostly into the world trade system. And they've built a lot of prosperity based on that. If you will, a lot of that Chinese prosperity is built because of economic freedom in the United States, if you will, because we've opened ourselves to trade from around the world. China's been able to become a trading partner of ours, and they've done very well, but we've also benefited by the goods and services that we've received in that trade relationship. China had a little bit of a spurt of economic reform when they joined the World Trade Organization about a decade ago now. But there really hasn't been much sustained reform at all since those initial reforms of the Deng Xiaoping era. And what we're seeing now is Chinese growth rates are starting to taper off. There are a lot of demographic problems in China. There are environmental problems in China. The things that the Chinese government and the Chinese people are going to have to deal with if they're going to build a truly sustainable economic system heading into the future. And we very sincerely hope that they will undertake those reforms. It's not easy in a country as large as China and one that's still growing rapidly. But if they want to actually maintain the progress that they have made in the future, I think if they would look to some more significant reforms in the economic freedom area, that would serve them very well indeed. They rank very poorly in our index right now, about 139, I think China ranks in the index. So been very little progress there at all.
If I may, after answering one specific question you raised about that lobbying, we'll take just one more question. I mean, typical way is, I mean, it's not like lobbying when you imagine. Typically we get the request about what kind of data you use, can you use this data, not that data, that kind of a gentle push. But as I said earlier, the key objective of our index is providing objective, reliable data across all the countries we cover. So for that matter, we cannot simply rely on one government source data. So if we have to use that data, we gently redirect that request through different internationally recognized sources, such as World Bank and IMF, because we are not the only researchers who are using those countries-specific economic data. If they are genuinely serious about spreading the good information, updated information they have, we believe that that has to be in a transparent manner.
I think we can take one more question, and then we're going to move to our panel. How about this lady in the back here? She's had her hand up for a while.
Thank you. Jennifer Lee with Hong Kong Phoenix TV. Question regarding Hong Kong. So Hong Kong has topped the economic freedom for 21 years. I wonder if you can comment on that. What's the advantage and the disadvantage you see from Hong Kong this year? And you think what other countries might be able to learn from them? Thank you.
Yeah, well, Hong Kong's had a remarkable record in our index, and it's a real credit to the leadership of Hong Kong and the people of Hong Kong that they've maintained such a high level of economic freedom. And of course, they've prospered from that as well. It has one of the highest incomes on a per capita basis of any region or country or economy in the world, I guess, to properly characterize it. Hong Kong's score deteriorated a little bit this year. That was primarily because of declines in the area of rule of law. There's been a lot of political controversy in Hong Kong this year as people engage in a very spirited debate, even in the streets to some extent, about the nature of democracy for the island moving forward. And I think that has raised some concerns. It's very important that the leadership respond in a way that respects the will of the people and that they try to institute democratic practices that really are legitimate and reflect the will of the people going forward. So as I say, we don't really measure political freedom, but I certainly, on a personal basis, have some concerns about what we see happening in Hong Kong there right now. But again, the record of Hong Kong in terms of economic freedom is unsurpassed, and a great credit to the people of Hong Kong. Thank you very much. We're going to bring our panel up now and have a little more in-depth look at our special chapters in the index. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Terry and Kim. Anthony. That was great. I really appreciate your overview of the great research you've done. We're now going to turn our attention to our panel for the day. We have on our panel three contributing authors to the book. We will start with Nick Loris. He is the Heritage Foundation's Herbert and Joyce Morgan Fellow at the Institute for Economic Freedom and Opportunity. He covers energy issues for us here at Heritage. And we have Steve Moore. He is the Chief Economist for the Institute for Freedom and Economic Opportunity. He will speak on his chapter on the Freedom Path to Economic Growth, a comparative analysis of country performance. And then we will hear Jim Roberts, who is our Research Fellow for Economic Freedom and Growth, who will speak on our chapter on cronyism, corruption, and the Arab Spring. Let's start with Steve. We'll go with you, and then we'll just go down the line.
Great. Thank you, Jack. First of all, congratulations to Terry and Anthony for an incredible report. I would say that the big issue out there in the world right now is what causes prosperity. And this has become a bit of a mystery to a lot of the economic and political leaders around the world. And we're seeing a lot of sense of kind of terror in a lot of places in the world, especially in Europe, even in places like China and other places that have had strong economic growth in the past, but have not been able to get out of this, what we're calling the Great Recession period. And so the thing that is amazing to me is you're seeing all these kind of fad economic theories that have arisen as a kind of formula for getting out of this economic morass that so many countries find themselves in, and I would make the case including the United States. And what is important about this document, this Index of Economic Freedom, is that it teaches us that this is not complicated, right? These principles about how you create economic growth are not complicated. They're fairly straightforward. Cut your tax rates, get your government spending under control, a rule of law, and so on. And yet those messages, I think, one of the tragedies of what's happening around the world today, and one of the reasons I'm nervous about the direction of growth across the world, is that so many political leaders and economists are leading their countries in a very wrong direction. And so let me give you a few examples. I mean, the United States is an obvious one. If you look at what happened in the United States during the Great Recession and virtually everything that the United States has done in response to the Great Recession, I would make the case that almost every single act that's been put in effect over the last 4 or 5 years has been exactly the wrong thing to do. So, we started with the $830 billion economic stimulus plan, and that was right out of the kind of Keynesian playbook. This is how the Keynesians say that you create economic growth. And if you look at the evidence of what happened as a result of that, even using President Obama's own numbers, not our numbers at Heritage, President Obama's own numbers, the economy grew more slowly. We had less job growth with the stimulus than we would have had if we had not done the stimulus. Again, those are President Obama's numbers, not ours. We had Obamacare. We had massive infusions of money. And all of these things have led to the worst recovery from a recession since the Great Depression. And this didn't happen by accident. It happened because the prescriptions were all wrong. And that's why it was almost humorous when President Obama, did his kind of icky shuffle in the end zone on Tuesday night when he talked about how we've gotten out of this crisis. For most Americans, they don't think America's out of the crisis. They think that this is still a recession because incomes have not grown. And I'd make the case it's because we've done so much wrong. Now let's look at Europe for a moment. Europe is also a basket case right now, as everyone knows. And they have moved precisely in the wrong direction. And every time things get worse in Europe, Europe adopts policies and reforms that move in exactly the wrong direction. And we've seen this with respect to the massive increase in government spending in Europe, and we've seen it with a deluge of money. And let me make a point about this because I think this is a very dangerous trend as I look around the world and look at these kind of fad new theories about how you create growth. One of the if you, for example, read what Paul Krugman says, one of the most prominent economists on the left, he basically says the formula for growth is very simple. He said this in one of his recent columns. All you have to do is print money. If you print money, you will get rich. And, you know, it seems like a lot of countries around the world have actually adopted that policy. I mean, look at what's happened with respect just in the last couple of weeks, that Europe isn't going to reform their obese welfare states. They're not going to deregulate their economy. They're not going to get rid of these sky-high tax rates that cause disinvestment. What they are going to do is print more money. And somehow that's going to cause the economies to grow. And I think we know from historical experience that that will fail, just as so many of these other policies have. Look at Greece. Look at Greece and what's happened just in the last few days. Greece is a basket case, as everyone knows, and amazingly, and a lot of economic leaders say this, and the voters voted on this, that they have concluded the problem with Greece is that there's been, quote, too much austerity. Too much austerity, and that's defined by many on the left as too much government spending cuts. You know, in other words, Greece has cut their government spending too much. Really? Really? If you look at this report and the reports of what's happening in Greece in terms of their spending, Greece now spends almost half of their GDP on government. And yet somehow, preposterously, the Greek citizens and many economists around the world say that Greece needs more government spending, not much, much less. And so what I'm saying is that we have to move away from these kind of pop fad economic theories and move to what works. And what's startling about the Index of Economic Freedom, and you saw the data that is so crystal clear, the statistical relationships between economic freedom and economic growth, is this stuff is pretty simple. It is not complicated about how you create growth. You cut your tax rates, you deregulate your economy, you get your government spending down, and you will have growth. And period, hard stop. That's the end of the story. So let me just say one or two other quick things and then turn it over to the others. That, you know, in our chapter, we looked at these pairs of countries that are very similarly geographically. They're very similar with respect to their ethnic situations and so on, and climate and all of these things. And what you find, you know, by looking at these pairs of country over and over again is that the free countries outcompete the unfree countries. And there's no other explanation for this other than the fact that they have freedom. And so, you know, I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but you look, one of my favorite examples is Chile and Argentina. And, you know, you heard some discussion about Argentina earlier, but Chile has gotten incredibly rich over the last 20 years, and Argentina has moved in a direction of bigger government, more regulation of their economy, and they've moved in the wrong direction. And let me just say as an aside, that one of the things I'm very concerned about as an economist is that I can say this as a Catholic, that, you know, our Argentinian Pope, Pope Francis, has the wrong. He's been, you know, pontificating, so to speak, about the dangers of free market capitalism, and unfortunately, I think Pope Francis has it all wrong. In fact, one of the cool things about this study is it shows that, in fact, the best way to reduce poverty in the world, something that every Catholic and Christian certainly believes in, is to move towards more economic freedom and more capitalism and free enterprise, not less. Finally, what we look at states, and this is a great, you know, example within the United States of economic freedom, and it's just very crystal clear and statistically proven that states that have low tax rates and more economic freedom, less regulation, right to work laws, and so on, substantially outperform states that don't. So if you look at the 4 biggest states in the United States today, those are California, Texas, New York, and Florida. 2 of those states have a high degree of economic freedom, Florida and Texas. Florida, Texas have no income tax, for example. In California and New York, the income tax is 13%. Texas and Florida are right-to-work states. California and New York are not right-to-work states. California and New York have very high minimum wages. Texas and Florida don't. And what you see, just in terms of job growth, just to give you one statistic, over the last 15 years, Texas and Florida have gained 3 jobs for every job that was created in New York and California. So economic freedom matters not just in terms of countries, but in states as well. Finally, just to summarize, I would love to see us abolish the IMF and World Bank and just give every economic leader this, right? If they had this and stopped listening to the advice of the IMF and the World Bank, the world would be a much, much more prosperous place. When I used to have dinner with Milton Friedman before he died, when he lived up in San Francisco, and that was quite a treat because Milton Friedman was the greatest economist of the last century, and certainly he would have agreed with everything in this report. I remember one of the times that right before he died, I asked him, you know, Milton, if I could give you 3 things that you could do to wave a wand to change the world and make it a more prosperous place, what would you do? And I just want to repeat the 3 things that he told me because it's so consistent with what's in this book and it's so wise. He said, number 1, school choice for every child in the world, in America and in the world. That's something you all know he devoted his life to. Second, he said free trade, that we should have a regime of free trade and lower trade barriers around the world. And then third, which I think is so important because it cuts right into these fads of Keynesianism. He said, then the third most important thing is that governments around the world have to cut spending. They have to cut their government spending. And I'll never forget, I said to Milton, well, Milton, by how much? And he said, as much as possible. And I think that's exactly the formula that nations should be following right now. Because if they don't, I am worried about maybe a second world recession driven by policies that are moving away from economic freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Nick?
Thanks, Jack, and thank you to Ambassador Miller and Anthony for allowing me to contribute to such a great product that Heritage puts out. You know, energy is really the lifeblood of the world economy and has fundamentally changed the way we live our lives. As economist Julian Simon put it, and others have put it, we call energy the master resource because it's rooted in everything we do. It's rooted in everything that we create. And the human ingenuity involved with being able to affordably and consistently turn the lights on, to heat our homes on days like today, or to fill up our gas tanks to get to work are all things we tend to take for granted. We don't question how the lights always stay on or how the groceries we need get to the stores where we need them. But all of these things require energy, and they dramatically improve our standard of living. The adage, you don't know what you got until it's gone, is undoubtedly true for energy. We get upset when our power goes out for an hour and we can't get on the internet or watch a Big Bang Theory marathon on TV. Or much worse, we realize the importance of a consistent current when a major natural disaster hits and we can't power our schools, power our hospitals, our food spoils, and we experience great discomfort. For instance, when Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005 on the Gulf Coast of the United States, 2.6 million people were without power in the United States. 2.6 million. Now multiply that 2.6 million by 500. That's how many people in the world are without access to modern electricity every single day. These 1.3 billion people don't know what it's like until it's gone because they've never had it. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa, they have 28 gigawatts of power. That's equivalent to the state of Arizona. There's just one difference between those two areas. One has a population of 6.5 million, and the other has a population of 860 million. So alleviating energy poverty remains one of the world's biggest challenges and opportunities. And granted, every country around the world faces its own set of challenges, whether it be political or economic. So the solutions aren't tightly wrapped in a nice, neat package, but the principles are. Whether we're talking about developing countries or developed ones, whether we're talking about renewable sources of energy or conventional ones, or whether a country is resource-rich or resource-deprived, the world can best meet its energy needs through free markets. The policies that sustain the 4 pillars of economic freedom, the rule of law, limited government, regulatory efficiency, and open markets are more successful not only in stimulating economic growth and supplying our energy needs, but also gaining access to energy and improving the environment and using energy more efficiently. Freer economies have access to more products and technologies that make our lives healthier and that make our lives cleaner. As a country grows economically, it increases the financial ability of its citizens to care for the environment and reduce pollutants emitted from industrial growth. We have the development of sanitation systems, the availability of garbage collection that greatly reduce many types of diseases and reduce toxins in the air and our water. But you have to look at it on a much more basic level than that. The availability of simple products like soaps, cleaners, detergents make our homes dramatically cleaner and healthier. Again, these are some of the things around the world that we take for granted, but make a tremendous difference in improving our environment and improving our quality of life, all of which we rely on energy to make and get them where they need to go. And as economies develop and they become richer, they also tend to be more capable of adopting greater energy efficiency through innovation. Both small and large innovations that improve energy efficiency add up to big savings. You can take a look at this water bottle, for instance, and look at the cap. Dasani has reduced the amount of plastic that it takes to put on this cap, and they can market this product as green now, but they're also doing it for another purpose. It saves them money. And so we can have market efficiencies without government mandates. And it's these accumulations of these small efficiency improvements that dramatically enhance a country's energy efficiency per dollar of gross domestic product. The US has shown what can happen when you have policies that emanate from liberty, specifically having open access to resources, having clearly defined and enforced property rights, and having opportunities for both domestic and foreign investment. We've been blessed here in America with abundance of natural resources, and one of the primary reasons the U.S. is propelled to the world's leading oil and natural gas producer is the fact that private individuals own the subsurface mineral rights, and the shale oil and gas revolution that we're experiencing is occurring on state and privately owned lands. As a result, from 2007 to 2012, the oil and gas industry grew at a rate of 40%, while the rest of the U.S. economy grew by 1%. And because we have these consistently low natural gas prices, we have all these energy-intensive companies flocking to the United States to take advantage and investing tens of billions of dollars to build their companies here. Similarly, Canada, one of the world's freest countries and most successful energy producers, also upholds strong enforcement of private property rights, opens access to development, and encourages investments in mineral and resource extraction. And while their regulatory body is certainly not perfect, it understands that it can produce energy and protect the environment at the same time, that these two activities aren't mutually exclusive, and that's something this administration in the United States doesn't seem to understand. Again, each country has its own set of challenges and opportunities when it comes to resource development, and that's certainly true with land use laws, which are extremely complex in different regions of the world. But the fact remains that delineated and enforceable property rights, along with decentralized land management, will be essential for rural energy and economic development in many countries in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia. While decentralizing land use rights is a step in the right direction, and which has occurred in some parts of the world, true reform will only occur when the legal structure and the rule of law protects these changes. Property rights will only be truly effective when combined with other measures such as access to legal services, a trustworthy and transparent government, and transparent judicial systems. In contrast to places like US and Canada, in many countries around the world, not only are land and mineral resources state-owned, but entire supply chains of energy production are partially or fully government-owned. Places like Saudi Arabia, Brazil, China, Venezuela, and many other countries control much of the production and distribution of oil and gas. Now, these government-controlled companies may still respond to the profit motive because it means more money and more power for them. But because they do not have to make the appropriate decisions in a true market environment, state-owned companies suffer from economic inefficiencies, reduced or zero foreign direct investment, higher rates of pollution, less technological innovation, and aging infrastructure. And when countries rely on oil companies' profits to fund other sectors of the economy, it means they're diverting resources that would otherwise be available to invest in new technologies or potential new areas of energy exploration and development. We've seen this in places like Venezuela, where over the past several decades, the country has poured billions of dollars into its military programs and its social programs, leaving the country with an out-of-date, inefficient infrastructure and huge gaps in energy investments. Some places around the world are understanding this. Take a look at Mexico. Mexico has adopted a series of reforms that will open up investment and competition for oil and gas production, for refineries, for power plants, pipelines, and enable it to upgrade its energy infrastructure. As a direct result, the U.S. Energy Information projects that not only will Mexico stop its decline in energy production, but it will level off and soon to be increased over the next few years. And we've seen changes in the laws to encourage foreign direct investment in places like South Africa, Mozambique, Australia, and many others. And this is promising. As Terry Miller mentioned, it's those incremental steps that take us in the right direction. Unfortunately, we still operate in a world where policies exist that engineer energy markets through a lot of government intervention. These policies both restrict access and investment. They do much more harm to our economic growth than to actually improve our standard of living. And these interventionist policies come in many shapes and sizes. And certainly the U.S. Is a case in point, not only for what to do, but for what not to do. And we've seen this over the past few years with stimulus spending and green energy investments. Only 3% of our federal lands and federal waters are open for leasing. So we're not doing all the good things here in the United States. We have a lot of energy problems as well. Ethanol mandates that mandate we produce 36 billion gallons of ethanol by 2022. And it's not that we're pro oil, gas, coal, and nuclear and anti-renewables, which I think sometimes the right gets criticized and conservatives get criticized for. It's that we're pro-market and anti-subsidy. And we're anti-burdensome regulations that artificially increase the prices of competitive energy sources. So we want to see the market compete because we know that's what works. And in fact, when governments invest taxpayer dollars in green energy sources, when they invest in frankly any other energy sources, it creates this dependence on government. So it actually does more to the long-term detriment of these technologies that they're actually trying to promote, because you're spending more time lobbying to the government to get access to taxpayer dollars. And when that round of spending is up, they're focusing their efforts on Capitol Hill trying to get more taxpayer dollars rather than innovating and competing in the marketplace, which is why we want to get rid of government spending for all energy sources and technologies, and why we promote these free market policies. So I'll wrap up now. I just want to thank again Ambassador Miller and Anthony. I focus on U.S. energy policy here, but hope to work with a lot of the experts around heritage, focusing on different regional areas to do some breakout papers on free market reforms in places like Latin America and Africa and Asia. So expect to be seeing those in the coming year. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Jack. Corruption and the cronyism that feeds it have been major problems throughout the history of economic development. One could say the world took one of the most significant steps away from cronyism and towards the rule of law 800 years ago this year, when the King of England was forced to sign the Magna Carta. The problem of cronyism and corruption remains, however, and it drags down all countries scored in the Index of Economic Freedom year after year, as measured by the Corruption Perceptions Index of Transparency International. It is especially tragic to see how corruption and the lack of secure property rights holds back the world's developing countries from their efforts to throw off backwardness and poverty. Rent-seeking cronyists in those countries too often thwart the ambitions of those who are working hard to build better lives for their families. This year, the index includes a case study that details the stunted growth of economic freedom in Tunisia by 3 World Bank economists who analyzed the harm inflicted on that country by cronyism. The 3 economists, Antonio Nucifora, Bob Reichers, and Eric Churchill, applied an analytical tool called the Limited Access Order, or LAO, framework. They found that, although progress has been made since the Arab Spring, the revolt against dictatorial regimes in North Africa that was touched off in 2011 by riots in Tunis that overthrew the 25-year rule of President Zine Ben Ali, the damage to the Tunisian economy from decades of authoritarian power had been done. At the heart of the LAO theory is the idea, in the words of the authors, that power is tied to organizations and not to the individual, and that rent sharing is the process by which a dominant coalition reaches an equilibrium which allows economic activities to continue to generate rents. Here's how the LAO theory worked in the Tunisian case. A small elite headed by the ruling Ben Ali family, and including military officers, senior government bureaucrats, state-controlled media, state-controlled civil society organizations, along with favored business firms, consistently made formal or informal agreements to ensure they remain the dominant players, entitled to extract rents and make profits from nearly every available economic opportunity that came along in Tunisia. Everyone else was pushed to the sidelines. The Ben Ali family firms were concentrated in sectors where profit margins are quite high, and close cronyist relations with government counterparts were an important determinant of profitability, notably in areas such as real estate, enterprise services sectors, personnel services, transport, wholesale trade, automotive trade, construction, financial services, the food industry, hotels and restaurants, and firms engaged in media activities. These firms were more likely to operate in sectors subject to entry regulation. Approximately 40% of the Ben Ali firms, as these World Bank economists found, were in sectors subject first to authorization requirements and second to restrictions on foreign direct investment. And these restrictions were codified in Tunisia's Investment Incentives Code, a law approved in 1993, a few years after Ben Ali took power. By comparison, these authorization requirements applied to only 24% of all sectors in which the Ben Ali family firms were not present, while foreign direct investment restrictions applied to approximately 14% of sectors that were free, blessedly free of the Ben Ali firms. So, although the Ben Ali government invariably promised the people of Tunisia that its policies would create jobs and stimulate investment, in practice their investment code had the opposite effect and mainly served the personal interests of those in power. The regime also helped itself by manipulating other levers of state power, for example, through discretionary enforcement of regulations on taxes, customs duties, public procurement, as well as by abusing public assets and public enterprises such as state-owned banks. The inefficiencies and distortions resulting from this system of rents extraction obstructed the development of a dynamic economic environment. And that is what is at the root of economic stagnation in Tunisia. And I might say in many other countries. Tunisia is just a case study. Few new firms were created, and productive firms did not grow, given that they faced unfair competition by cronyist firms. The emergence and expansion of any innovative and dynamic firm in Tunisia was further hampered when they were forced to purchase expensive and low-quality goods and services needed for their operations from the inefficient cronyist firms. As a result, Tunisian entrepreneurs were generally only competitive in labor-intensive, low-skilled tasks. This further limited their access to investment flows. As a result, unemployment in Tunisia grew rampant. Most jobs that were created were in low value-added activities, mostly in the informal sector. Those jobs offered low wages and no job security. Such jobs certainly did not meet the inflated expectations of the growing numbers of graduates of the state-funded universities. While Tunisia's rents-prone economic system grew steadily more inefficient, it also became highly inequitable. Under Ben Ali, a small group of 114 entrepreneurs appropriated a large share of Tunisia's wealth. And here we can see parallels in many other countries suffering from cronyism that we've discussed today. For example, Putin and his 140 or so billionaire oligarchs in Russia. Corruption in Tunisia became synonymous then with social exclusion. The LAO framework analysis by the World Bank economists revealed that regulatory restrictions and connected firms go hand in hand. The vast majority of Tunisian entrepreneurs lacking political connections were left out in the cold. Now, fortunately, however, Tunisia has made progress on the long road back from the Ben Ali kleptocracy to a market-based democracy, with some help, in fact, from some of my colleagues at Heritage who've gone to Tunisia a number of times. Changes to the policy infrastructure are needed, however, especially in the country's system of laws and regulations that are still in effect from the Ben Ali era. Inequality of opportunity continues to plague Tunisia. Today, the current institutional infrastructure continues to create an insider-outsider culture. As the World Bank authors note in our chapter in this year's index, the LAO framework analysis suggests that the changes must be implemented very carefully. these reforms, but they must happen. Since opening the economic system sparks pushback from those in the old elite who stand to lose rents and privileges, the reforms cannot move too quickly, lest political instability undermine the reformers' political power. On the other hand, slow progress will undermine the process by fueling the frustrations of the marginalized groups in society. Unfortunately, as the authors report, Tunisia is not an isolated case. Their findings match the findings of other studies that show that countries with more extensive business entry regulations tend to grow more slowly, have higher levels of corruption. So corruption and burdensome business regulations, as we've discussed, are seen together. This cancer of cronyism has been gradually creeping into many first world countries in the past few decades too, including the United States. As President Jim DeMint mentioned this morning and wrote recently, and Chairman Ryan also mentioned this morning, the collusion between big government and other bigs, big business, big labor, green energy, and others, insulates the powerful and enriches the wealthy. Meanwhile, regular people are being squeezed out of the American dream by this 21st century favoritism. The case of Tunisia and other developing countries described in the 2015 index should serve as a wake-up call for Americans to demand that their elected officials in Washington stop the downward spiral of the U.S. into greater and greater cronyism and corruption. It is all too easy to fall into the cronyist pit, but it is very difficult to climb out. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, Nick, and Steve. Wonderful presentations all. We have a few minutes for Q&A, so we'll open it up. Please wait for the microphone. Let us know who you are and your organization, and let's, do we have any questions? All right, up here in front.
Hey, I'm Brian Riley from Heritage, work on trade policy. I'm not a budget expert, but my question really is for you, Steve. When I hear some members of Congress talk about how we've cut spending in recent years, could you elaborate on what they mean by that? And
The countries have what?
In the United States that we have cut
Right.
spending. Could you elaborate on whether we've cut spending and what people mean when they talk about that, and maybe how we should think about cutting spending?
Well, Paul Ryan touched on this, and in my opinion, he's got the story exactly right, that, the first, few years after the recession were, a catastrophic cascade of bad policies: Obamacare, tax increases on the rich, bailouts, stimulus plans, and those caused extremely low growth coming out of the recession. As Paul Ryan said, I mean, one of the kind of turning points in terms of our fiscal policy was the Budget Control Act of 2011. And if you look at what's happened with government spending, this is the first time in, I think, since like the 1950s, we've had 3 straight years of declining federal spending. That's an amazing thing. Now, granted, that's probably off this huge increase that we had in 2009 and 2010. And here's the interesting thing about this. I mean, if you read, I don't want to pick on Paul Krugman, but he is kind of it's shooting fish in a barrel, right? But I mean, he is kind of the icon of the left. And if you read what he and others were saying, they were saying, there is no way the American economy can possibly grow when we're cutting government this fast. And in fact, government spending has fallen and growth has actually risen, just the opposite of what Krugman said. So if we stick to those caps and then put in place a lot of the entitlement reforms that we've been talking about at Heritage, I think you could see, a big growth spurt. So, in other words, just to summarize, the Keynesian story doesn't fit with the data that we've seen, what's happened in the United States over the last 8 or 10 years.
Other questions? Yes, over here.
Hi, Laura Truman with the Heritage Foundation. I wanted to ask about Switzerland being in the top 10. And yet it's a European country, and we think of Europe as having a growing welfare state. So if you could talk a little bit about Switzerland. I know they have an individual mandate on health insurance, but it's not government-run health insurance. And I think they're also considering voting on a basic guaranteed income for every person in Switzerland, which sounds quite welfare-ish to me. So How are they in the top 10 with their welfare state?
I'm not an expert on Switzerland.
Well, luckily, we have Anthony Kim, who is an expert on this. So I'll defer to Anthony to answer this if you don't mind.
So maybe I speak from here then. Thank you for your question. Actually, that's a great question because when you look at the Switzerland, it's a bit of an outlier. It's in Europe, as you mentioned, but it's not part of the European Union. It's not part of the Euro. So the country enjoys very high level of independence in terms of policy making. That means the country has a lot of flexibility and efficiency and also very high level of competitiveness in the system. So even though they have those mandates, the operation they do is very much free market based. And that's what makes the difference. That's what makes Switzerland very unique. And also that's why Switzerland is ahead of the United States. And also people in Switzerland, they do know what kind of bad policies they can, in fact, invite. And if you remember last May, they had a national vote on minimum wage. I think people there, I think they really make a strong voice against the minimum wage law. So those things, including flexibility and economic dynamism, and then the policy-making independence, that makes all Switzerland very unique and free market-based.
I'll just add, Switzerland is #1 in the world in trade freedom, #3 in the world in property rights, and 7 in freedom from corruption. So.
Yes.
Steve Landy, Manchester Trade. 2 questions. One is a specific one, general. Specific question is that when we work in Africa, and many of us do, and we really enjoy working with the heritage experts and so on that you have, particularly Charlotte and Mr. Kim and others, and so on. But when we work in Africa, our big emphasis is on regional integration, because our basic view is that 47 small countries carved up by the Europeans at the Treaty of Berlin in 1876 really can't carry the modern responses of good governance. How is something like that measured in your index of economic freedom? And then the second question, which is a more generic question, is I don't think anybody, left, right, center, kind of said, boy, I can't wait to bail out the banks, or boy, I can't wait to bail out the automobile industry. But at that moment, at least, the general consensus was that a failure to bail them out would have frozen the economy, would have sort of. How do you measure that? It's one thing to say, and I understand that obviously it reduced economic freedom, but on the other hand, the alternative could have been much worse. So how do you guys measure that in this excellent index of economic freedom? Thank you.
Steve, do you have anything on the bailouts particularly? And I'll go to Anthony for how that's accounted for in the measurement.
Just on the bailouts, this is a tough one because we don't know what the counterfactual is. We don't know what would have happened if we hadn't bailed out the banks and the auto companies and the insurance companies. And I would simply make the case that, if we had let the normal bankruptcy laws take place and let the people who made the malinvestments and the poor investments lose, and the people who did the right things, in other words, let the winners buy up the losers, I think the economy would have recovered. And I think actually the big problem with what we've done with these bailouts now is we have a new kind of economic constitution in this country that says any time a big institution fails, they have a big safety net underneath them. And I think it's extremely dangerous for these principles of economic freedom that we talk about in the book.
And Anthony, could you give us a word on how you account for that in the measurement?
Yeah, just quickly, as we all know, bailout is part of political decision, in essence. So, and very short-sighted and also ill-timed in many cases. So the way we pick up that, negative impact is through government spending, for example. So in order to bail out a company or industry, the government has to spend money, right? So that data will be shown in the government spending factor, and that's how we capture the negative impact of bailout. In fact, that's what we shown in our 2010 index when the United States score went down in a large manner.
I think that might be our last word. Other than, let me thank Anthony Kim and Ambassador Miller on really this great project. I really want to thank you also for allowing me to host this event today. It was I enjoyed it very much. With that, I want to invite all of you to join me in a round of applause for our participants. And to let you know, we have a light lunch and beverages, I believe, out in the foyer. So thank you all very much.